Vivian Cross was 37 years old the morning her husband stood on the steps of the Fulton County Courthouse, threw his head back, and laughed. She had watched him do it from across the street, behind the tinted window of a car he would not have recognized, in a coat he had never seen, with a phone pressed to her ear connecting her to an attorney, whose name he did not know existed. He was celebrating. He had every reason to believe he had won. He had spent the better part of 2 years constructing what he believed was an airtight case, one that would award him half of everything they had built and leave Vivian with the house, a modest settlement, and the quiet inconvenience of starting over. To look at her, starting over seemed manageable. She drove a 10-year-old Accord with a dent above the rear wheel well. She wore sensible shoes and carried a canvas tote bag. She worked as what she described to anyone who asked as a mid-level contracts coordinator, which was accurate the way a photograph of the ocean is accurate. It shows water, but gives you no sense of the depth. What Terence Cross had never asked, not once in 9 years of marriage, was whose name was on the leasing company that owned the building his firm rented. He had never asked about the property portfolio that had been growing, quietly and deliberately, for 11 years before she ever said his name. He had never asked about the trust her grandfather had established in 1987, which she had been managing, expanding, and protecting since she turned 25. He had assumed she was not the kind of woman who required close attention. He was about to understand, in a Fulton County courtroom, with a judge and 2 attorneys and his girlfriend seated 2 rows back, exactly how wrong that assumption was. The Lamborghini had nothing to do with showing off. It had everything to do with the title in the glove box. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening light came through the plantation shutters of the kitchen in long amber slats. Falling across the counter, Vivian had tiled herself over a 3-day weekend 4 years prior. She had chosen the tile carefully, a muted bone white with a faint texture that caught light differently depending on the hour. She had laid each piece with the same deliberate patience she applied to everything that mattered. The kitchen was the most honest room in the house. It was the room where she had done the most work and the room she had loved the longest. She was at the counter now, pressing dough into a pan with the heels of her hands, not because she was domestically inclined in any particular way, but because her grandfather had always said that the best thinking happened when the hands were occupied. Isaiah Cross had told her that when she was 9 years old, standing beside him in his own kitchen in Decatur, Georgia, and she had never stopped finding it true. Isaiah had been a property attorney for 40 years before arthritis made the paperwork difficult, and he handed the practice to his daughter. He had started buying land in Georgia in the 1960s, when no one thought land in Georgia was worth buying. And he had spent the decades that followed, quietly, methodically, building a portfolio that most of the family did not fully understand until he gathered them in his living room one Sunday and explained it to them. He had left Vivian his sharper instincts and his complete lack of interest in appearing impressive. "What you own quietly," he had told her once, "no one can take loudly." She had kept that. She kept most of what he gave her. She had met Terence at a real estate conference in Atlanta 7 years before the divorce petition arrived. He was handsome and confident and quick to fill a room, the kind of man who was good at the parts of real estate that involved speaking and not especially interested in the parts that involved reading. He had his own small development firm, 3 mid-level projects, and a business card that listed 4 professional designations. She had liked his energy. She had underestimated what he would eventually decide he was entitled to. The first year was uncomplicated. The second year was warm. By the third year, something in him had shifted in a way she noticed, but did not name. The way you notice a change in a building settling before you can say precisely which wall is moving. The first concrete sign came on an unremarkable Tuesday in February. She had come in from a meeting to find a business card on the kitchen table she had not placed there. It belonged to a family law attorney. It was not face up. It had been slid partially beneath the fruit bowl, far enough to be hidden and not far enough to be gone, which told her everything she needed to know about the level of care Terence applied to the things he wanted hidden. She photographed it where it sat. She replaced it exactly as she had found it. She was done asking questions before she understood what she was asking about. The next 3 weeks moved like a careful survey. Vivian did not confront, question, or change her behavior by a single visible degree. She cooked dinner. She asked about his projects. She appeared, to anyone observing from the outside, to be a woman entirely at ease in her life, which she was, because she was not afraid of what she was finding. She was building a record. What she found was not simple. It began with a calendar notification she saw reflected in his phone screen one morning, a detail she did not intend to see and immediately understood the value of. The name on the notification was Brianna. The appointment was listed as a lunch, though the location was a hotel in Buckhead she recognized from a development deal she had reviewed 2 years prior. She noted the date. She cross-referenced it against a credit card statement she still had access to through a joint account they maintained for household expenses. The charge was there. A 4-hour block billed to a suite that did not accommodate lunch. She did not react. She moved to the next date, and the one after that, because she already understood that the first discovery is never the whole discovery. It is the door. What matters is what you do once the door is open. Over the following 2 weeks, she traced 18 months of a pattern that had been constructed with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you are not being watched. Brianna Foles was a marketing director with a downtown address, a recent lease on a condominium in Midtown. And, it turned out, a connection to Terence that predated his marriage to Vivian by approximately 3 months. The condominium in Midtown had been partially financed through a personal loan that traced back to a line of credit Terence had opened against a joint asset without Vivian's signature. Her hands did not shake when she found that. She was a contracts coordinator, among other things, and she knew what an unauthorized encumbrance looked like. She printed the bank records and placed them in a folder. She placed the folder in the fireproof lockbox her grandfather had given her when she first started managing the trust. She closed the lockbox and put it in the back of the closet behind winter coats, beside 2 additional folders she had been adding to for 11 days, and she went to make coffee. Preparation was the work. Everything else was consequence. She called Claudette Marsh the following morning at 7:45. Claudette had been practicing family and estate law in Atlanta for 19 years. She was small, precise, and entirely unmoved by the financial complexity of any case she encountered, which made her the right attorney for work that required looking at large numbers without flinching. She had come recommended by the financial advisor who managed the trust, a woman named Sandra who had handled the Cross family's affairs for more than a decade, and who had said, simply, Claudette does not lose what her clients own. They met in Claudette's office on a Wednesday morning. Vivian set the lockbox on the desk, opened it, and placed the 3 folders in front of her attorney without a word. Claudette read for 11 minutes. He opened a line of credit against a jointly held asset. Without my signature. Without your signature. Claudette set the papers down and looked at Vivian with the steady attention of a woman who had seen this before and found it no less useful to examine carefully each time. He also filed for divorce in February, which means he's been consulting that family law attorney for at least 3 months before the petition arrived. That was my assessment, He believes this is a standard marital asset division. Vivian looked at her attorney. He doesn't know what the marital assets are. Claudette allowed herself the smallest pause. Then, we'll need to show him. They spent the next hour on strategy. The trust was Vivian's alone, established in her name before the marriage, maintained in her name throughout, and not commingled with marital funds by any legal measure. The property portfolio under the trust included 8 residential units, 2 commercial properties in metro Atlanta, and a parcel in Savannah that had tripled in assessed value since her grandfather purchased it in 1971. None of it was marital property. None of it was subject to division. The line of credit Terrence had opened was a different matter. That was fraud against a jointly held asset, and it was the kind of fraud that, when placed in front of a judge alongside the rest of the documentation, would not require a great deal of interpretation. Some things spoke entirely for themselves. 2 days later, Vivian drove to Decatur to see her grandfather. Isaiah Cross was 81 years old and still kept the same armchair he had sat in for 40 years, angled toward the window that looked out over the yard he had spent 3 decades tending. His hands were slower than they used to be, but his mind moved with the same deliberate authority it always had. He listened to everything Vivian told him, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching the yard through the window. He thought he knew what he married, Isaiah said. Yes, and he stopped looking close enough to learn otherwise. A long time ago. Isaiah nodded slowly. A man who won't look at what's in front of him will never see what's coming at him. He turned back to the window. You know what to do. You've always known what to do. Go do it clean. She drove back to Atlanta in the early evening. The city came up around her as it always did, lit and wide and indifferent, and she felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely settled. Terrence came home that night to dinner on the table, and his wife asking about a project he'd been managing in Cobb County. He talked for 45 minutes. She listened, and responded at the right intervals, and offered nothing of herself. She was performing ordinary life with the accuracy of someone who had studied it carefully, and found it not especially difficult. He noticed nothing. He never had. By the following week, Claudette's office had added 3 more elements to the case. The unauthorized line of credit had been flagged formally with the issuing institution. A forensic review of the joint account established that $47,000 had been redirected over 22 months through a combination of account transfers and cash withdrawals that bore no relation to any household expense either party could document. And one additional item, one Vivian had not anticipated, had surfaced. Terrence's development firm carried a silent investor whose capital contributions had, on 2 separate occasions, been misrepresented in the firm's internal filings. The silent investor, it turned out, had already retained his own attorney. He had 3 problems where he believed he had none. The vehicle had been purchased 18 months prior and registered in the name of a holding company that sat beneath the family trust. Vivian had not driven it publicly. She had not mentioned it. She had kept it garaged at a property on the north side of the city and used it on the rare occasions when she needed to remind herself that certain decisions had been good ones. It was not an extravagance. It was a record of what could be built when a person paid consistent attention to what was underneath. She drove it to the courthouse on the morning of the hearing. She parked it 3 spaces down from the building entrance and walked in without looking back. The courtroom was smaller than the word implies. A conference-style hearing room on the 4th floor, afternoon light coming in at a low angle. A long table with chairs on each side and the judge seated at the end with the composed patience of someone who had adjudicated enough marital dissolution to recognize, very quickly, when one party had come prepared and one party had come confident. Terrence, sat with his attorney. Brianna Foles was in the gallery 2 rows back, dressed in a manner that suggested she had expected this to be a celebration in installments. His attorney opened with the standard framework, a request for equitable distribution of marital assets, which he enumerated with the confidence of a man who believed he had mapped the complete territory. Claudette waited. Then, she opened the first folder. She walked the judge through each element with the unhurried clarity of someone who did not need the room's attention because the documents commanded it on their own. The trust, established in 1987, managed by Vivian since age 25, containing assets that predated the marriage by more than a decade and had never been commingled. The property portfolio, fully documented, fully separated from any marital account by every applicable legal standard. The structure of the holding company that owned, among other things, a vehicle registered to that company and not to either party personally. Then, the second folder. The unauthorized line of credit, the $47,000 in redirected joint funds, the forensic account summary, 4 pages, line by line, the flagged misrepresentation in the development firm's filings, which was, Claudette noted without raising her voice, a matter that a separate legal process would be addressing in due course. The judge reviewed the second folder for longer than the first. Terrence's attorney asked for a recess. The judge declined. Terrence looked at Vivian across the table for the first time since they had sat down. She looked back at him with the same calm attention she had given him for 9 years, the same quiet she had carried into every room he had ever underestimated her in. He tried then. He leaned toward his attorney and spoke in a low voice, and his attorney straightened and said that his client wished to propose a revised settlement framework that might address some of the concerns raised. Claudette said, simply, "We're not here for a revised framework." Terrence looked at his own hands. What he had never understood, not once in 9 years, was that Vivian had not built the things she built for him to see. She had built them because her grandfather had taught her to build things that would still be standing long after anyone stopped looking. She had been doing it before Terrence arrived, and she had never stopped doing it, and everything she had built was exactly where she had left it, documented and clean and entirely hers. "You assumed," she said, speaking quietly, without animus, in the tone of a woman who had already finished grieving this particular loss and moved through to the other side of it. "You built your plan on what you thought you knew. That's the only mistake that matters now." She gathered her portfolio. She stood. She walked out of the room, and she did not look back at him, and the door closed behind her with the quiet finality of something that had always been going to happen. 16 months later, the dew was still on the yard when Vivian came out to the porch with her coffee. The house was new, purchased outright, a craftsman on a wide lot in a neighborhood where the trees had been growing since before any of the houses existed. She had done part of the renovation herself, the kitchen tiles again, because some habits were worth keeping, and the built-in shelving in the front room, and the porch railing she had fitted board by board over a long weekend in March. The yard still needed work in the far corner. She was getting to it in stages, the way she got to everything. A man named Elliot came through the front door with his own cup and sat in the other chair without being asked. He was a civil engineer who worked in municipal infrastructure and who had, from their first meeting, asked questions about her work with the kind of interest that did not require performance. He was quiet in the mornings. She had learned to appreciate that. The trust had expanded. A 9th residential unit had closed in February. The Savannah parcel had been rezoned and was under contract. Vivian had started consulting 2 evenings a month with a cohort of young women coming through a property management program at a local college, teaching them what her grandfather had taught her about building things that held. Terrence's development firm had dissolved. The misrepresentation matter had resulted in a settlement that cost him the firm's remaining assets and most of his professional standing in the Atlanta market. The unauthorized line of credit had been adjudicated against him fully. He had moved, she had heard through a former colleague, to a smaller city where the market was less familiar with his name. Brianna Foles had relocated as well. They were not, as far as anyone knew, together. Vivian heard this and registered it and did not return to it. The morning came in over the yard in the way that good mornings do, without announcement, simply arriving and filling the space that had been waiting for it. She held her cup with both hands the way her grandfather had always held his, and watched the light move through the trees and thought about the land beneath them, what it was worth, what it had always been worth, what it would go on being worth long after anyone stopped thinking about it. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. She had better things to do with the time. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.